In 2008, a caving couple entered New Zealand's Luckie Strike Cave. Nearly an hour into their journey, one of the cavers, a 32-year-old woman, stopped for a moment to rest near a gorgeous waterfall. Suddenly, catastrophe struck and she suffered serious injuries. Her male counterpart was forced to make the agonizing choice: stay with her until help arrives, or leave her alone in the darkness to go get help. Find out what he chose and if his partner survived in the Luckie Strike Cave rescue. Before we dive into the video, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to our channel. Currently, only 8% of our viewers are subscribed, but your subscription helps us create more content like this. Simply click the subscribe button, like this video, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads. By doing so, you'll also help YouTube recommend our content to a wider audience. Without further ado, let's jump into the video. Caving has been a popular hobby and tourist activity ever since the New Zealand Speleological Society was founded back in 1949. Hundreds of thousands of people travel to New Zealand to explore the caves, with the majority of visitors traveling to the Waitomo district, where hundreds of caves extend deep into the earth. The name Waitomo comes from the local Maori language, which roughly translates to water flowing through sinkholes. Waitomo tunnels, like the glowworm caves, are world famous for their populations of Arachnocampa luminisa, unique glowworms found only in New Zealand. While many of these caves are tourist attractions for non-cavers, some caves give real splunkers a run for their money. Today's story takes place in Luckie Strike Cave, considered one of the toughest caves in the country. Luckie Strike is owned privately by the Chandler family, though they do allow experienced cavers to explore its dark reaches. It takes pro cavers 3 to 4 hours to reach the back end of Luckie Strike, and that's only if they're skilled enough to make it all the way through. Recently, cavers Mike Allen and Dave Ellicott tried to explore Luckie Strike to find a connection between its end and the Junior Mudball cave system. Jane Furkett and her partner got permission to explore the cave together. They thought they had been through everything caves could throw at them, so they were prepared and physically fit for the sporty challenge. Soon after entering, the pair found a long, narrow room with hundreds of straws, needles of calcium carbonate or sulfate dripping mineral water from the ceiling. Unlike regular stalactites, these straws are hollow, which makes them far more fragile. These delicate formations take thousands of years to develop, but a gentle poke will send them crashing down to the floor. The pair crouched through the section, ducking just under the straws. Beyond this area, Luckie Strike requires cavers to spread their legs across a jagged crack and almost jump from side to side to move across the chasm. Other areas require cavers to push their feet and hands against two walls and move forward across the gap. This technique is known as bridging, and both of these dangerous sections are usually done without ropes, so one wrong move could easily lead to certain death. Luckily, the ground here is usually dry. The lights of their headlamps moved across glistening speleoforms, casting warped shadows along the cave walls. Haunted by the sound of dripping water and the eerie stillness of the cave, the two splunkers tied themselves together to traverse undulating sections of smooth stone. The rope gave them some stability and security in case one fell, and they needed to have the rope ready for the next area. The next pitch opened high above the previous area. To get across safely, they attached their gear bags to a rope and pushed it across the large chasm. Then they attached their own harnesses and zip-lined across to the other side. From there, they would abseil up the rock face. This technique is like the climbing version of rappelling. This technique uses a double rope affixed to a high point in case they slip and fall. Near the end of the cave, they'd have to dig their way through mud and rock to push through narrow tunnels to the exit. There, water levels can easily push into the face of cavers while rocks stab into their sides. The area here is very similar to the atmosphere of the nearby Junior Cave with its thick and endless tunnels of mud. However, these two cavers wouldn't make it that far. Beyond a large, slanted room full of boulders, Lucky Strike opens into a riverbed. To explore the end of the cave, the two had to walk against the flow of the water while a steady shower drips from overhead along the pathway. To overcome faster flowing sections, cavers affixed a rope along the side of the river. This connects to a thin bridge of rounded stone that leads upward. By now, the cold was getting severe. The ceaseless flow of water constricted their fingers. Their torsos went rigid as blood flow diverted to their central organs and their muscles tightened. Furkett was climbing up the side of the riverbed chamber when she reached a small ledge. She unhooked a traverse line that connected to the next section to take a break. Big mistake. Her foot gave way. The rope quickly tethered as her weight suddenly dropped into her harness. Her fingers, still numb and wet from the cold, damp chamber, couldn't grip the rope that was moving with the force of her entire body. The rope slid from her hands, whipping through the anchors as she tumbled backwards. Her legs shot up toward the ceiling, and her body instinctively bent forward, trying to grab the rope. She saw the wall blur past as her vision moved to the ceiling. As her arms hung in the air, she had no time to scream. She landed on her bottom at the floor of Luckie Strike Cave. Jane's partner called to her above the sound of the rushing water. He got to her as fast as he could. She was still conscious and groaning in pain. One of her hands instinctively went to her side, and the other covered her mouth. As the man approached her, his lamp cast a grim light onto her face. She had fallen nearly 30 feet down, and her hand was dripping with blood that looked almost orange as the yellow light reflected back into his eyes. He asked if she was all right, and she spat thick globs of blood as she tried to respond. The pain kept her from speaking full sentences. She tried to respond in gasps, and as she spoke, he saw some of her teeth had shattered. Some broken teeth were lodged in her gums, while the stumps of others leaked blood, like the hollow straws near the cave's entrance. Her head was on fire with pain, but this injury wasn't bad enough to keep her stuck here. She wasn't even focused on the blood or the pain from her teeth when she spoke. Instead, she muttered that her hip was in pain. The other caver tried to gently touch her side to see if he could pinpoint where the pain was and what was wrong. She jerked away. The amount of pain Furkett was experiencing could only mean one thing. Her hip had been shattered by the fall. The waters of Luckie Strike continued to slam into them both. Realizing the cold river would quickly overtake them, he told her that she would have to brace herself. He raised her upper body as best as he could and slowly dragged her down the river. She slipped from his grasp, and he stumbled to catch her. His ankle nearly twisted from the sudden maneuver over the top of smooth, wet rocks of the riverbed. Jane nearly hyperventilated to prevent herself from screaming in pain as it seared through her whole body. Miraculously, her fellow caver pulled her from the water to a drier section of the cave, but the waters would still pose a threat. As adrenaline gripped her body, she wouldn't be able to notice her own body temperature. The adrenaline constricted her blood vessels and sped up her heart rate, making hypothermia more likely to claim her fingers and toes, and eventually her life. The other caver knelt by her side. He reached for first aid, but he fumbled with the gauze as his thoughts raced. To prevent her from freezing, he wrapped their survival blanket around her. She tried to grab it, but her bloodied hands caused it to slip from her grasp. He tried to be noble and told her he wouldn't leave her, they'd make it out together. As time passed by, her shock continued to get worse. She told him that staying here would be the death of them both. He had to go get help. Now. Hesitant to leave her behind, he took off most of his extra equipment and rushed back through the boulder chamber and across the bridging gap. He stumbled through the cave straws, not caring about anything other than saving her life. He had to get out of the cave. Once outside, he contacted emergency rescue crews. Police, search and rescue volunteers, ambulance medics from the nearby St. John, and caving experts all arrived to lend their aid. In total, 25 people came to Jane's aid. Rescuers knew Luckie Strike was a difficult cave. They needed a stretcher with a body harness to keep her secure during the long ride out of the cave. These stretchers have a solid plate to provide stability, along with long sides and flaps for the head and feet. They use colored straps so rescuers can easily connect them in the dark without mixing up the order, which would cause the stretcher to dump the injured caver to their death. The mostly enclosed stretcher would allow the team to lift Jane at angles and around tight corners. The cave entrance was a 20-minute drive from the nearby town along narrow country roads, but slowly, rescuers lined the roads as they congregated at the mouth of the cave. The rescuers split into teams and stormed into the cave. The fall happened around 2:30 p.m., and nearly 4 hours later, the first rescue crew was still trying to progress through Luckie Strike. Their progress was slowed because some of the rescuers needed to move carefully and slowly while rigging a haul system for the stretcher. The river wasn't a straight path. It had twists that got narrower over time, and it had waterfalls. Usually, cavers would use the ropes to climb around the waterfalls, but rescuers would need to make a straight pathway through the raging waters. As rescuers continued to create an exit path for Jane, another volunteer from the Auckland Westpac Rescue Helicopter Trust pushed on ahead alone into Luckie Strike. This rescuer was not only a skilled caver, but also an advanced paramedic with tons of experience in high-pressure situations. They knew that the rigging lines were vital to the saving of Jane's life, but the paramedic knew that Jane needed immediate medical attention or the ropes would be useless. The paramedic arrived at Furkett's location hours before the rest of the crew and found Jane was still alive, but her soaked clothes were causing her to lose body heat fast. Her hip injury wasn't life-threatening. Instead, hypothermia was her greatest enemy. The paramedic stabilized her leg and torso to prevent further damage to her bones and to reduce the nerve pain that was crippling her where she lay. Meanwhile, lines were rigged high above the ground in many places to give the stretcher enough room to dip around the corners and avoid the hazards below. They loaded her into the bright orange cocoon. Her stretcher swayed perilously above the dark abyss, far further than her earlier fall. Her fate rested in the skills of the rescuers who had quickly anchored the pulleys and ropes just hours earlier. Wriggling or jerky movements in the stretcher could cause anchors to dislodge. It could cause rescuers to drop her, or sudden movements could throw them all off their pathway and send them all crashing to their own deaths. To avoid her accidentally wrecking the rescue plan, they administered painkillers to dull the brutal pain that radiated through her core. At 1:30 a.m., nearly 12 hours after her painful ordeal started, Jane was finally freed from the grasp of Luckie Strike Cave. The awaiting ambulance drove her out of the forest into the nearby town, where a helicopter took her to the Waikato hospital. Once there, she was treated for hypothermia, and her condition stabilized. Rescuers said this was one of the most challenging rescue operations in New Zealand's history, thanks to the physically demanding nature of Luckie Strike and the complicated pathway of the rigging line. This difficult cave continues to attract cavers, but only the bravest and most adept cavers should even consider risking their lives beyond the straws, the gaps, and the waterfalls hidden deep below ground in Luckie Strike Cave. Thanks for watching. Do you know any harrowing tales of cave rescue or tragedy that you'd like to see? Tell us about your favorite stories in the comment section below. If you want to see more videos like this one, hit that like button and subscribe to catch the next spine-tingling cave rescue story.